Well, everybody here knows who I am, all familiar faces. For the folks at home, though, watching this at some point later, I'm Codie, Eash, Director of Education and Interpretation here at Seminary Ridge Museum and Education Center. Welcome back to Fridays on the Ridge. We've had a little bit of a break with some exciting events happening recently. Most recently, last weekend, our 24 Hours on the Ridge, fourth annual in support of the Adams County Community Foundation Giving Spree. We'll learn in the next several weeks just how much we earned once they compile all of the earnings of all of the nonprofits around Adams County. But thank you all for your participation. If you contributed, thank you so much for that. Some wonderful volunteer work that we had from several people who are here in the room with us today. So, once again, a worthwhile event for us, and already coming up with plans for things to add, things to change, things to even improve upon for next year, for the fifth. So today we're going to focus on the election of 1864. And as we were all just talking a moment ago, when I first sort of conceptualized the idea of doing this, looking at the calendar back in July, August, whatever it was, when we were kind of sketching out the fall, we decided, once we hit November, we'll move the Fridays on the Ridge programs back inside. The weather gets a little more unpredictable. Little did we realize we would have 75, 80-degree days in the first week of November, that we could have done this outside, maybe. But we also were looking at, we like to look at time of year, on this day sort of history. What's happening at the time of year historically that we want to talk about. And we saw that on this day, November 8th, 1864, 160 years ago to the day, is the presidential election of that year, one of the most fateful, as we'll talk about, in American history. And looking at it sort of in the abstract lens, before the conventions have taken place, before we really kind of hit the meat of the election season, you think, oh, how timely. This would be on the week of a presidential election. And then as you get closer and closer and closer, and it's contentious, and we're all getting texts constantly and seeing ads on TV constantly in a swing state, you then start to realize, maybe we should have done this a couple weeks before the election so that people wouldn't be absolutely tired of it by the time we get here. But alas, here we are on the 160th anniversary to the day. In case anybody, is not tired of talking about presidential politics. It's been 3 whole days since we voted. It's been 1 whole hour since I received a text saying, don't forget to vote. There's still time to vote. So those are still rolling in, which is wonderful. But talking about this election in 1864. So when I was, my first presidential election was 2012. I turned 18 in 2011. And I remember being at Shippensburg University, and I was in United Campus Ministry, a Bible study group on campus, and we were sort of discussing the upcoming election. That year, of course, would have been Mitt Romney versus Barack Obama. And we were reading an article that for the life of me, I cannot find. I was trying to find it to make the exact reference to it. But I remember the content of it was a journalist named Brian Roberts, not to be confused with the longtime Baltimore Orioles second baseman. I don't think it was him, at least. But he writes this piece in which he says, in part, a saying that comes with, it seems like, every election in recent memory. He says, stop saying this is the most important election in our nation's history. That was when Abraham Lincoln was elected president. Before that, we thought it was okay to own people. And that, of course, is oversimplifying a lot of messy, complex issues, but the point stands that when we think about presidential elections, we so often say in that moment, we hear pundits, we hear the campaigns and the candidates themselves say, this is as important as it gets. And when we live in the moment, of course, it can really, truly feel that way. But looking back across the broad spectrum of American history, there are obviously those elections that stand out much more than others. 1800 is perhaps a key example of that. In more recent memory, we could say, because of its historic nature, regardless of which side you're on, 2008, that this nation really conceived at a time when, of course, there will not be the end of slavery until after this election in 1864, that we elected the first black president, a black president at all, less than 150 years after slavery had ended, is historic. There are many others over the course of that time as well. Those on either side of the world wars, for instance, really kind of stick out to us. And as time goes on, we will probably see that the period from 2016 to now, these elections will certainly stand out in the broad spectrum, the long term, of really significant for transforming American life, politics, maybe a realignment of parties, the way that we know them. Those are the elections that really stand out to us. And I would say that I agree with Brian Roberts' assessment in 2012 that 1860 is probably about as important as it gets. For both good reason. It is, of course, the election that ultimately gives us the candidate and the president who will be responsible for overseeing the destruction of America's original sin, as it's oftentimes referred to. But also on the bad side of things, that what allows that to happen is that 7 and eventually 11 states decide they do not agree with the results of that election, and that they are going to break away from the United States of America, leading, of course, to civil war and the deaths of at least 620,000, maybe as many as 750,000 Americans in the process. But what can oftentimes get lost in that shuffle, and when we focus on 1860, is Lincoln's re-election campaign of 1864. And that's, of course, what we're going to focus on this afternoon, because it's just as important as 1860, maybe even more importantly. And I'll give us a couple of reasons as we go about. But just to kind of set this up from the outset, a few major reasons why this election is extraordinarily significant. One, when we think about it on a global scale, it's the only time in human history that a republic held a national election in the middle of a civil war. Now, there are not many times that could have happened in American history, but that it did, just a few decades, less than a century into the American experiment, when everything is so incredibly fragile, when everything could come crumbling down, when Lincoln is utilizing presidential powers that had never been utilized before. Many determined that Lincoln could have, constitutionally, if he wished, utilized this moment to say we're not having an election in the middle of the Civil War. But he decides that he wants to hear the will of the people, and the nation proceeds to have a free and fair election in the middle of the most critical period, the most critical crisis in American history. So that's one gigantic takeaway. The second, and this was especially relevant, of course, in 2020, but we even saw some of the results of this in 2024. This is the first time where we see en masse people voting early or by absentee ballot. And that comes about because there are, during the course of the war, 2 million United States soldiers who are not at home, not able to vote from their polling place in their hometowns. And so we're going to see a massive amount of effort placed upon allowing these soldiers fighting for their country to cast their ballots. And they will vote, as we will see, spoiler alert, overwhelmingly for Lincoln. 75% of soldiers who vote for the sitting president. So that's a second reason. And the third that I'll kind of highlight now, and we'll talk more about this as we go along, this election is a mandate on whether the Civil War, from the United States perspective, was a war solely to preserve the Union as it was, and the Constitution as it is, as the saying went, or whether this would be a transformative experience going forward. Whether the American people were okay with emancipation as an official Union policy, but also, as we will see, in the Republican Convention's platform, they propose an amendment abolishing slavery. This will now change because of this election. These two things sound similar, but there's a distinction between them. Is it a war to free enslaved people, or is it a war to end slavery? Those are two different things. Do we free the people who are in slavery but keep the institution legally intact, or do we destroy it as a result of this war and as a result of the electoral process? So those are three things to really consider as we start to make our way through this story. So let's get our candidates up to the time that they are running against one another. Here are the first known images of either of these men. On the left-hand side, Abraham Lincoln, in his 30s at this point in time. On the right-hand side, we have George McClellan with his father and a sister, but here is George McClellan well before he is the general we know as the young Napoleon and the Democratic candidate in 1864. Both of these figures, by and large, need no introductions, but just to kind of get us them on the same path, facing one another. Lincoln, of course, born in Kentucky, raised in Indiana, lives for most of his life in Illinois, riding the legal circuit, becoming a wonderful stump speaker, running for the Illinois State House, famously saying in his first major address at the Young Men's Lyceum, telling his audience in this prescient line that has been used so often throughout American history, that as a nation of free men, we must live through all time or die by suicide. That's going to really launch this political career for Lincoln. And that will especially be the case come 1854, giving this famous speech at Peoria, Illinois, really kind of escalating him into a figure who maybe could run for Senate in a couple of years. And that, of course, will lead in 1858 to him running for the United States Senate against Stephen A. Douglas in that famous series of debates. Lincoln loses that, but it gives the new Republican Party hope that there might be this potential figure who could be useful on a larger scale. Of course, in the middle of that, we also have Lincoln serving one term in the United States House of Representatives, coincides with the years of the Mexican War, 1846 to 1848, and it will really be that term in office that sets Lincoln as this figure who opposed the Mexican-American War, who opposes the extension of slavery, and it will be his thoughts and feelings building from that point through the 1850s that make a lot of Southerners especially afraid of exactly what Lincoln would do when he is eventually elected president. Now, during his time when he is in Illinois, running for Senate especially, Lincoln is commonly utilizing the Illinois railroad system. And as he's doing so, there's a young man who is working on that Illinois Central Railroad, I believe is the official name of it, in George McClellan. And George McClellan says that there's this sort of bumbling backwoods buffoon who's running for office, who's this well-known lawyer from Kentucky and Illinois. He doesn't have a high opinion of Lincoln, and any interaction that he has with him all throughout this time, he doesn't see that there's any political prospect for this man who will eventually, of course, be his commander-in-chief not that long after. George McClellan really kind of cuts his teeth in a couple of different ways. Before the Civil War, he goes to Crimea. He's visiting Europe, sees the Crimean War firsthand, comes back to the United States with this idea of how warfare should be, entering the middle portion of the 19th century. Will utilize a lot of these lessons as he eventually takes command of United States forces at the beginning of the American Civil War. Now, to give us some context of just how old George McClellan is compared to the man who he will eventually replace. He's in his 30s at the start of the Civil War. Major General Winfield Scott is in his 70s, and he's been in the United States military for something like 50 plus years. Forget the exact number. George McClellan is younger. He has lived fewer years than the entirety of the time that Winfield Scott, his predecessor, was in the United States military. But George McClellan is going to make his way through the ranks extraordinarily quickly. He'll be at places like the Battle of Cheat Mountain in what is now West Virginia at the start of the Civil War. And he is credited for keeping the western side of Virginia, which becomes West Virginia in 1863, keeping it pro-Union. He is credited with his victories, for making sure that southern Ohio or Kentucky don't ultimately fall into the hands of the Confederacy or become Confederate aligned. These are the sort of things that George McClellan is doing as a very young man, given his position, that will really make him an appealing prospect to succeed Winfield Scott when Scott retires as the Civil War is opening. And that will ensure George McClellan becomes not just the commander of the Army of the Potomac, this chief Union fighting force during the Civil War, but that he'll be named for a time as General-in-Chief of all United States armies. Lincoln, of course, takes the presidency in 1860, wins that year, is inaugurated in 1861, and throughout the next year, we'll start to see George McClellan has a rise of his own, ultimately commanding all of Lincoln's armies. Now, as we get through 1862, we will see that these two men who initially have a okay working relationship with one another starts to fracture, where we start to see that George McClellan is writing letters home to his wife or to other members of the United States military, referring to Lincoln as things like the original guerrilla, not looking favorably at all upon the commander-in-chief of all United States armies. We'll see that fracturing after McClellan is seen as being too cautious, not willing to commit troops to battle, overestimating the numbers of Confederate forces in front of him on places like the peninsula of Virginia in the spring of 1862. And Lincoln relieves McClellan of command for a time throughout that year, and then will retain him, of course, as we get later into the summer of 1862, leading to the Battle of Antietam. Now, here's the great irony of George McClellan's political career. Military career, I should say, and political to an extent, is that George McClellan is entirely in favor of keeping this as genteel, as gentlemanly a war as possible, of not waging hard war upon the South. And certainly, as conservative as he is, of not making this a war in the name of emancipation. The irony, it'll be his last battle in command of the Army of the Potomac that will ensure Lincoln is going to issue an Emancipation Proclamation, the Battle of Antietam. It'll be in the days immediately after that Lincoln issues that preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, and within a few weeks, in October 1862, where this famous meeting takes place just outside of Sharpsburg, Maryland. When these two men meet and have several photographs taken that day, reports are that in between these shots, they're yelling at one another. They are absolutely at odds with one another, and it's only a matter of time before Lincoln is done with George McClellan and ultimately fires him once and for all. McClellan is credited with being this great organizer of federal forces, but not utilizing them effectively on the battlefield. And a lot of recent scholars have, poked some holes in just how horribly historians have seen George McClellan through the years. But by and large, it's obviously an adversarial relationship that is heeding the progress of the Union war effort. I think many people would agree with that. This is November 1862. This is a sketch of George McClellan riding amongst his army for the final time. He's relieved of command, but he nevertheless will keep his head up. Some would say that head is a little too big and being held a little too high, where he is going to say things like, "I've never seen so many people crying at my relief from command," which is, it seems, based on a lot of soldiers' accounts, true in many respects. We can see, for instance, before Gettysburg, that becomes a rumor that George McClellan is back in command of the Army of the Potomac, and a lot of Union soldiers are excited by that. They generally do like him personally. They think that he did create this big fighting force that ultimately could quell the rebellion. But political operatives, of course, elected officials like Lincoln, like the War Department, don't quite see it that way. But this is going to be in Virginia as McClellan is riding amongst his men for the last time. It won't end his military career. He stays a major general in the United States Army. But essentially what happens is they're going to send him to New Jersey, his home state, and essentially tell him, await further orders. And those orders simply never come. And so that's going to be how we see George McClellan exit stage right, head over to New Jersey, and really kind of sit out the remainder of the Civil War in any sort of official military capacity. But as he's there, George McClellan is going to start earning the trust of a lot of Democratic operatives in New York City in particular. And on the one hand, people say, yeah, we need this young man who has just come off the battlefield. He can be a viable candidate for president. He can be a viable voice for the Democratic Party as someone who is not inherently anti-war, but is anti-emancipation, who could see this war through to its end, someone who's been there, someone who has sacrificed himself and sacrificed soldiers, and the soldiers do, by and large, love him. And so that's on one end of the spectrum, people who say this could be a good move for McClellan, this could be a good move for the Democratic Party, and of course the Democratic Party thinks that's a good move for the Republic. Others, though, including McClellan's brother-in-law, becomes one of the big proponents of this. He says George McClellan is too impressionable. He is an extremely impressionable person. Anybody could tell him anything and he'll believe it, i.e., the numbers that he's given in 1861-62, and he believes them outright without any further investigation. And so there are a lot of people in George McClellan's circle who say this could be dangerous. If we have a man who is this hungry for power, who has an axe to grind against the sitting president, in the middle of a civil war, we don't know how this would go. If he's elected president, what policies would he enact? Would it make the entire war and all of the soldiers who have died to this point, would that all be potentially in vain? But nevertheless, he is going to continue earning this support throughout the latter portion of 1862 and especially through 63. You have the midterm elections of 1862 by and large go the Democrats' favor. As we see, the pendulum swings back and forth. Wide Republican gains in 1860, including the White House, swings back in the Democrats' favor in 1862. And then you have these off-year elections like 1863. And unfathomable to us today, the campaign for presidency doesn't begin in earnest until the spring of 1864. They do it only about 6 months out from the election rather than from 3 years out like we do oftentimes today. But we'll start to see a lot of art like this. We'll start to see, I think this is the cover of a song sheet, where more and more and more, as we so often see throughout history, it hasn't happened a whole lot lately. John McCain, perhaps the most recent example we have, albeit decades removed from his military service. But we oftentimes, of course, see during times of war or right after times of war, it'll be generals, it'll be military figures who are more often than not seen as viable presidential candidates. Look no further than George Washington, Dwight Eisenhower, the series of post-Civil War generals, including Grant, on down to Garfield, and beyond. But McClellan is experiencing the difference. The war is still happening. The conventions are going to kick off for the Republicans first, which is temporarily rebranded the National Union Party. More on that in a moment. That convention takes place in the first week of June 1864, when this scene is playing out at Coal Harbor. And so this is the military backdrop set against which this election is going to be set. When we think about the ebbs and flows of the American Civil War, we so often say for the first 2 years, things aren't going well in the East for the Union. They are going well in the West. This rises to power. Ulysses S. Grant. The pendulum starts to swing in 1863 because of Gettysburg and Grant's victory at Vicksburg. Then we sort of see that there's this period of quietude entering the fall and winter of 1863. But now there's some optimism in the spring of 64 as Grant is in command of all U.S. armies. But then Grant's first campaign in charge of all those armies, as he rides with the Army of the Potomac, will be incessant, day after day, the battles of the Wilderness and Spotsylvania Courthouse and North Anna River. And here this scene at Cold Harbor, which leads us right into Petersburg, and from there to the end of the war, the de facto siege of the campaign around Petersburg, Virginia. But this is what, by the spring of 1864, is facing the Lincoln administration. This is just one image, but it is emblematic of the bloodiest year, the bloodiest campaign, day after day after day, that these folks will have seen by that point in time. That's the uphill battle for the Lincoln administration. Now I put Republican in quotes for the party platform because there's a temporary rebrand by the Republican Party. It's a brand new party. It had just been effectively created a decade earlier. But they will rebrand themselves, as we can see, the National Union Party. And this is an effort to move away from the plan of 1860, which was this party of former Whigs, of liberal Democrats, of former members of like the Liberty Party and these anti-slavery abolitionist parties. They sort of all made this coalition that became the Republican Party. A lot of basis in the Northeast, in the Mid-Atlantic, in the Midwest, the modern Midwest, then just the West for the most part. But now we're going to start to see that there's an emphasis on maybe we can start to bring in Unionist pieces of the South. Those states of the Confederacy that were among the last to secede or that seceded reluctantly. Places like Arkansas, Louisiana, Tennessee, Western North Carolina, now new West Virginia. They're going to start looking at those places and say, maybe we can work with them. They are members of the Democratic Party by and large, Andrew Johnson among them, the military governor of Tennessee, the only senator of a seceded state who did not secede with his state is Andrew Johnson. Goes a long way in making sure that he's going to be Lincoln's running mate in this election. But all of those cohorts will together create this National Union Party. It is the Republican Party. It's just known by a different name. It's a little bit of rebranding, a little bit of a sales pitch, if you will, to moderates, and especially in this case, moderates equals Southerners. So a couple pieces about the actual platform itself. There are going to be several platform points that are written out much longer, I should say, than what we see here. We'll talk about a few of them. And by the way, this platform is written by Henry Raymond, who is the editor of the New York Times. Today, we so often think, of course, that media, that our interpretations of media, that our vacuums in which we live, that we are surrounded by people who think like us, who read the same as us, news interpreted through a political lens, we think, I can't get any more polarized. You literally have, in 1864, the editor of the New York Times is writing the platform of the Republican Party. We don't quite have that today. In 1864, and throughout the American Civil War era, you could tell most things about a person's thoughts on moral issues, political issues, in this case the war, by what newspaper they were carrying under their arm. And this is a great example of that. So let's talk about some of these points. So the first point was to do everything in our power to aid the government in quelling by force of arms the rebellion. So the very first tenet they want to say from the outset is to fight and win the war. Despite the scenes we just saw at Cold Harbor, despite the mounting numbers of casualties, we need to ensure the American people that we can take this war through to its ultimate conclusion, that we can win it, that it is winnable. The second point is to prosecute the war with the utmost possible vigor to the complete suppression of the rebellion. To not only continue fighting this war and not only win it, but to completely get rid of secessionist elements, to completely destroy the rebellion, to completely destroy what Lincoln calls the so-called Confederacy. He'll consistently use that term because he doesn't believe it to be an actual separate sovereign national entity. The third tenet is an amendment to the Constitution which shall terminate and forever prohibit the existence of slavery. First time on a major party platform we see an emphasis being we need a constitutional amendment to end slavery. This is going to be maybe the key mandate of them all. It's been going on 2 years since the Emancipation Proclamation. That was a presidential executive order during a time of civil war. It freed 3 million of the 4 million enslaved people, and it only impacted states of the Confederacy. The other million come from those 4 border states: Maryland, Kentucky, Delaware, and Missouri. Now we have, for the first time ever, a constitutional amendment being proposed by a party platform that we need to, once and for all, not just free enslaved people as a measure of war, end slavery through constitutional amendment. The fourth tenet, a provision for survivors who have received disabling and honorable wounds in the service of our country. As Lincoln would say eventually in his second inaugural, to keep an eye out for the widows and orphans of soldiers. They are concerned about this. This is a war where the butcher's bill is piling ever higher. Hundreds of thousands have died. Another 100,000 plus will die for the next year or so. We need to take care of them, they say. And this is the first time in American history without Veterans Affairs, without any sort of major pension system along the lines of what we have today. This is one of the firsts in American history that the federal government has never had to worry about before, not on this scale. The fifth tenet, Abraham Lincoln has discharged the great duties and responsibilities of the presidential office. They have to put a point there about the specific, not just policy, not just platform, but the man who they want to lead this charge, because that's not a given entering this convention. There's, as we will see, there are some contenders to bump Lincoln off the ticket. But writing this platform, Henry Raymond and the leaders of the party want to make it clear Lincoln is our guy. We don't want anybody else. We want him to be the person to continue through prosecuting this war. The sixth tenet, we deem it essential to the general welfare that harmony should prevail. Yes, we're in a time of civil war. Yes, we want that war to end. Yes, we want to win that war. Yes, we want an amendment to the Constitution. But ultimately, we want to see peace come out of the end of this. We don't want it to be a messy conclusion. We want to fight, win, succeed, and bring the country back to some semblance of harmony to reconstruct the nation. Continues here for another few tenets. Here's Henry Raymond himself, who writes this platform. The seventh tenet is the government owes to all men employed in its armies, without regard to distinction of color, the full protection of the laws of war. The first time in American military history that we will see over the course of this 1862 to 1864 period. Not an integration by any means. That won't happen for nearly another century under President Harry Truman. Not an integration of the federal military, but a plea and a promise that soldiers, no matter their color, no matter their race, will receive equal treatment. And in this case, this is especially here because 1864 is a year in which we will see the likes of Fort Pillow, a massacre of captured United States colored troops in Tennessee, among many others. This is something that is highly concerning to Lincoln, and he gives a series of speeches. Some of you have heard me talk about this before, earlier in 1864 at the sanitary fairs in Washington, Baltimore, and Philadelphia. This is something that really concerns him, is that there's all these news reports that they find that they're all true, of black U.S. soldiers being captured by Confederates, and they're not taken to prisoner of war camps as white soldiers are. They're summarily executed or put to hard labor. And so that's going to be an important point for the party. The eighth tenet, foreign immigration, this is an important term, should be fostered and encouraged by a liberal and just policy. So it's inaccurate today to say that the parties have flipped compared to 1864 or the entire mid-19th century, but terms like this, and we'll see the same thing on the reverse side, the Democratic platform talks a lot about wanting conservative policies. We can see the realignment since this time. The Republican Party is, by its very platform, deciding that it wants a liberal policy on this, in this case of immigration. The Conservative Party of the Democrats, it's reverse of what it is today. The issues are, in most respects, entirely different. We've gone through a few realignments since then, especially around the period of FDR, and then again at LBJ throughout the 20th century. The ninth tenet, we are in favor of the speedy construction of a railroad to the Pacific coast. A reminder, the Civil War is the most important thing happening in the United States, but it's not the only thing happening in the United States. The Transcontinental Railroad is a major piece of that. The Homestead Act is happening, just after this. Things like that have these broad national consequences that aren't directly dealing with the war itself. A reminder, those things are still continuing to happen. The public debt must be kept inviolate. And for this purpose, we recommend a vigorous and just system of taxation. They're coming to realization that this war is extraordinarily expensive, that they need an income tax has been instituted as a result of the Civil War. We're seeing a broadening of the national powers of taxation, and of course the military draft is another issue that had come out of the American Civil War. We need a way to pay for this, is what they're saying with this tenet. And finally, the United States can never regard with indifference the attempt of any European power to supplant by fraud the institutions of any Republican government. Now, we are largely clear of those, I won't say threats, but rumors of Confederate forces getting the foreign assistance of France and England. Once emancipation becomes a policy for the federal government, by and large, that's a deal breaker for foreign governments, especially those who have abolished slavery already, like England and France. But now there's this concern, what if there should be any foreign interference in our election, in our social system? We are a nation that is in the middle of a whole lot of controversy, of a whole lot of consequence. We're fractured right now. Democracy is very much on the ballot in 1864, as a lot of people interpret it. And they ask the question, what if there should be foreign powers who want to interfere with this? We need to make sure we don't have our leaders. We need to make sure we don't have our government perhaps being influenced by them, especially at a moment when this can be a highly fractious situation. So that's the Republican Party platform. Now there are some rumored rivals for Lincoln. Salmon Chase, a member of his own cabinet, Secretary of the Treasury. Lincoln eventually sends him off to the U.S. Supreme Court. John Fremont, a former candidate for president himself, in 1856, had been the first Republican candidate for president. He's an abolitionist general, has gotten himself in a lot of trouble for enacting emancipationist policies before the Lincoln administration was open to that earlier in the war. Ben Butler, typically seen as a Democratic figure, a controversial figure, nevertheless, especially in places like New Orleans. But he's the man who really sort of set up emancipation as a war policy as we know it. by allowing what he called contraband of war, enslaved people coming into Union lines at Fortress Monroe earlier in the war. Without his actions, it's quite possible that emancipation would not have happened when it does. He really sets that into motion. And of course, this guy, who will be the candidate for president 4 years later, Ulysses S. Grant. He makes it clear, I am not interested in this. I want no stake in the political side of this war. I want to lead these armies to victory. And he'll say right up until 1868, he is not interested in ever being president of the United States. But of course, he ultimately will receive the nomination 4 years later. Both 3 military and 1 cabinet member who are going to be some of these Republican rivals who are put forth as possible replacements for Lincoln, an increasingly unpopular president, including among those of his own party, as the war does not seem to be going terribly well that summer. And then they're going to make this switch, as we talked a bit about a bit ago. Hannibal Hamlin, this Mainer, hardy New Englander, very much on the anti-slavery side of the Republican Party. You can't really get a more opposite figure than we get in Andrew Johnson. One of the great what-ifs of American history. Many historians say this is the worst thing that President Lincoln does while he's in office, is makes the decision to make this man his vice president. An ardent white supremacist. He does not favor emancipation. He does not favor the same version of Reconstruction as Lincoln and many members of Congress had opted for. But 16 presidents in, they've never had to rely upon a vice president in case of an assassination, of course. They have no idea the change that will be wrought by him being the 17th president of the United States just after Lincoln's inauguration the following year. Alas, we have this man who will probably pull a lot of Southern votes, including attempted votes from his home state of Tennessee. This is a side note of this election that we won't get too much into, but there are a lot of votes that are not counted in Louisiana and in Tennessee, both of which have a lot of unionist sentiment. But because the laws of those states remained intact, but the states themselves left the United States, declared themselves as part of a separate entity, there's this sort of constitutional crisis of what do you do with those votes? And a lot of those votes are ultimately not counted. We'll see a lot of political cartoons. Of course, those have been a fixture of American politics, but here are a few that come out of the 1864 election. This one's my favorite. It's this famous Lincoln line. This reminds me of a little joke, because he would oftentimes introduce stories. And in this case, the little joke is George McClellan. He's holding in his hand there. Little Mac, yep, exactly. But we can see, here, there's some really kind of ornate ones here. This one is a Democratic one called the Abolition Catastrophe, or the November Smash Up, which is basically highlighting this idea that bringing abolition into the equation has done more to destroy any sort of unity within the Union than it has unity to fight against the war effort. Here's another pro-democratic one. It's George McClellan saying the Union must be preserved at all hazards. And Lincoln on one half of the map is pulling apart the United States, saying no peace without abolition. And Jefferson Davis, president of the Confederacy, pulling apart the other half of the map with a speech bubble that says no peace without separation. So we can see a couple of different interpretations here. Here we have one that's sort of I think this is like a marionette figure. We see Lincoln here with George McClellan. So we can see just a few examples among many. This is also, so that's sort of the lighthearted side of things. Political cartoons. We can look at those and laugh at many of them today. There's also an extraordinarily dark piece of this campaign. It is, up until that time in American history, and unfortunately it will be outdone in the elections that follow, it is the most white supremacist campaign run to that point by the Democratic Party in this case. And we can see they're outright throwing around that word right in the front pages of newspapers. We'll see that there will be publications which refer to Lincoln as King Africanus I, referring to Lincoln as King of the Africans. We'll start to see this term miscegenation thrown around, where there were these, rumors, stories that are created where there would be these large, and they'll use this term, there would be these large orgies of black and white people together. There would be a lot of soldiers responding to this, especially those who had not yet served with black troops throughout 1864, where they're going to start writing home and they're going to say, what is this that I hear? That there are black soldiers enjoying picnics on the lawn of the White House? and they're just going to freely throw around the N-word and terms adjacent to it. And this will be commonplace in both official party not the platforms, but official party publications and banners and things like that, but as well as in editorials and poems and candidates campaign things like these. So that's a dark piece of this campaign. Now, throughout that summer of 1864, we see in a lot of Lincoln's writings, there's a lot of contemplation about what this election could potentially mean. He is asked by many people around him, because of what we just saw on that last slide, he's asked if he would have avoid talking about emancipation. Can we drop the idea of an amendment to end slavery? Can we drop that from the platform? Would you consider making this once again a war in which this is solely about preservation of the Union as it was, the Constitution as it is? And Lincoln will start to write a lot of letters throughout 1864 in which he's going to discuss the matter of how could I rightfully look 3 million people in the face and tell them that as a measure of this war, I freed them, but that as soon as the war is over, I return them to slavery. He writes at one point in time saying, especially about those black soldiers, 180,000 of whom will serve for the United States by the end of the war. He says, if I should tell the warriors of Port Hudson and Olustee and Milliken's Bend, these battlefields in which large numbers of black soldiers had been engaged, he says, if I shall tell them that they are to be returned to slavery after this war, I shall be damned in time and eternity for so doing. And then he starts to make this pivot as well, where he starts to ask people who are asking him if he can abandon emancipation, if he can abandon abolition. He says, if nothing else, even if you don't agree with any sort of semblance of racial equality, can you not agree that by pulling the abolition lever, as he terms it, we have gained a lot. We've gained nearly 200,000 soldiers to fight for our armies. And as he tells one person who writes him a letter, he says, you do not seem willing to fight for them, but many of them seem willing to die for you. And it will be really that mentality that carries Lincoln through that summer, making sure that we've moved on from this solely being just a war for union, or even just a war in which emancipation would be a war measure. It has achieved something more. He is seeing it as more of a moral issue. And because of that, he'll start to receive hearty endorsements from the likes of this man, Frederick Douglass. Now, Douglass will write this decades later, but he's looking back on this meeting in summer of 1864 with Lincoln. Lincoln doesn't think the election is going to go his way. And so what he decides to do is he invites Douglass to the White House. This is their second meeting of 3. They'll meet in 1863, where Douglass goes to the White House. Now in 1864, Lincoln invites Douglass to the White House, and they'll meet again in 1865 at Lincoln's second inaugural. Well, here on August 19th, 1864, Douglass explains the subject of their meeting. What Lincoln said on this day, said Douglass, showed a deeper moral conviction against slavery than I had ever seen before in anything spoken or written by him. I listened with the deepest interest and profoundest satisfaction, and at his suggestion agreed to undertake the organizing a band of scouts composed of colored men whose business should be somewhat after the original plan of John Brown, to go into the rebel states beyond the lines of our armies and carry the news of emancipation and urge the slaves to come within our boundaries. Lincoln promises Douglass a military commission. It never happens, but he promises him a military commission between August and November, go into the South, and essentially give us a non-violent version of John Brown's raid. Go gather up enslaved people, bring them north, because I don't know what will happen to them if I should lose this election. And this will make Douglass a wholehearted supporter of Lincoln in this election. Now, he had been a supporter of Lincoln since emancipation, but he had sort of waffled on just how committed is Lincoln long term to freed people. And this will ensure, for his sake, that he's convinced Lincoln is the guy for the job. There will be these political campaigns taking place throughout that summer, but we also have military campaigns that we can't ignore that will have a distinct effect upon the outcome of the election. The Overland campaign we talked about a bit ago. Spotsylvania Courthouse depicted here, but also Cold Harbor on that image we looked at a while ago. This man, Jubal Early, is going to get right to the doorstep of Washington. The Battle of Monocacy, July 9th, 1864, eventually leading to the fight at Fort Stevens, right outside the nation's capital. Lincoln becomes the only sitting president ever to be under fire in the middle of a battle. And we have here a scene from Chambersburg, just west of us, 30 miles away, where we're going to see, as this campaign is happening with Early in Maryland and around Washington, D.C., the burning of the city of Chambersburg. Things are not going well. We can't emphasize this enough throughout the mid to late summer of 1864 for the Union war effort. And so Lincoln is going to issue what we now know as the Blind Memorandum. On August 23rd, 1864, his cabinet members will sign this side of the paper. If we were sitting in that cabinet room and you were one of those cabinet members, this is the only side of the piece of paper that you saw. This side, Lincoln keeps to himself. It's why it's called the Blind Memorandum. He is asking them for a blind trust. Sign your name to this document without knowing what it says. And what it says, in Lincoln's writing, Executive Mansion, Washington, August 23rd, 1864, this morning, as for some days past, it seems exceedingly probable that this administration will not win re-election. Then it will be my duty to so cooperate with the president-elect as to save the Union between the election and the inauguration, as he will have secured his election on such ground that he cannot possibly save it afterwards. Lincoln is saying we need, between now and then, to ensure we put into effect policies that can win this war and secure its results. Because if George McClellan wins, this is not going to be the same Union that we're trying to preserve right now. But also it's extraordinarily important, not to make too many parallels between now and then, but when you really think about this, this is a president who is ensuring in the middle of a civil war that the most important thing of all is not who wins or loses. It's that we can peacefully transfer power from one administration to the next, no matter the consequence. Now we have the Democratic Party platform as we start to wind down. This is going to be a shorter platform than the Republican, the National Union Party. The Republican convention, by the way, had taken place in Baltimore. This one takes place in Chicago. And these are going to be the basic points of it. The Democratic Party says we will adhere with unswerving fidelity to the Union under the Constitution of the United States. That's an important thing for this party to say because they're being accused of being an anti-Union party. Copperheads, that term, of course, used derisively to refer to those who remain loyal to the Union but oppose the war. And a lot of people will say that by opposing the war, you are opposing the Union. So they make the first tenet of their platform to say, we have unswerving fidelity to the Union and to the Constitution. 4 years of failure to restore the Union by the experiment of war demand that immediate efforts be made for a cessation of hostilities. The war is not working. It is not worth it. This is in vain, is what they're saying here. The third tenet, direct interference of the military authorities of the United States in recent elections, was a shameful violation. These accusations against the Lincoln administration of stripping away habeas corpus, of taking away the rights of some people to vote in portions of the Confederacy, are saying this is a shameful violation of the Constitution. This is an overreach of federal power, especially of the executive branch. Preserve the federal union and the rights of the states unimpaired. This is a states' rights argument by a loyal Union party. So here we can see a lot of people think that this first point needs to be here so that they can say we are loyal to the Union, but they will still say we are a loyal Union party, but states' rights is still an important piece of being an American state. Shameful disregard of prisoners of war in a suffering condition deserves the severest reprobation. This is the closest I think these two parties get to being on the same page. They both write things about prisoners of war because this is an increasing concern as we see the likes of Andersonville and Libby Prison just absolutely overpopulated. When we see the prisoner exchange program break down, the thing that the Democratic Party does not say, is not willing to say, that the Republican Party was, is that one of the reasons why they're not exchanging, one of the reasons why this system has broken down, is because of that wanton disregard of black soldiers, that they are being executed. That's why the Republican Party, the Lincoln administration, even U.S. Grant, they don't want to exchange prisoners anymore. The Democratic Party is taking sort of a broader approach and saying it's a shame. We need to do something about the overpopulation at these prisoner of war camps. And finally, sympathy is heartily and earnestly extended to the soldiery. This is an important distinction, as we will see. This will be the sticking point for George McClellan, because, in a little bit of a plot twist, George McClellan does not accept the nomination at this convention. He's not willing to go entirely along with that platform, in part because of how that last line is worded. We're going to see a series of actions on the military front that are going to all go the Union's favor, and thus all go Lincoln's favor. Atlanta will fall in the middle of Sherman's march to the sea. And then McClellan, just after that, is going to accept the nomination on September 8th. I have the honor to acknowledge my nomination by the Democratic National Convention, recently made at Chicago, as their candidate in the next election for President of the United States. But the Union must be preserved at all hazards. I could not look in the face of my gallant comrades of the Army and Navy, who have survived so many bloody battles, and tell them that their labors and the sacrifice of so many of our slain and wounded brethren had been done in vain. That we had abandoned that Union for which we had too often imperiled our lives. And I have the wrong two there, just realized that. A vast majority of our people would, as I would, hail with the unbounded joy the permanent restoration of peace. Another but, no peace can be permanent without union. George McClellan feels, as a veteran general of the United States Army, in the middle of this war, that the Democratic platform was too anti-war. He says, yes, we need to restore peace, but I can't look in the faces of all of those hundreds of thousands of men who I've just led and tell them this is worthless, this is pointless. Just end the war at all hazards. There's a nuanced view of George McClellan that I think we need to have here. That although he feels fundamentally different than Lincoln about the purpose of the war, the role of emancipation, the role of union, he nevertheless says, it is a war worth fighting, and thus it's a war worth winning. It's not a war just worth ending at literally any cost necessary. But he does eventually sign on and accepts the nomination. A couple of brief examples here as we approach Election Day. We see presidential polling start to take shape at this point in time. Say what we will about presidential polling, as we've seen in the last few cycles. And it'll be done by the people immediately around Lincoln. John McClellan, John Hay, his private secretaries. There's a great anecdote where they're riding on a train. I think it's from Harrisburg to Pittsburgh or vice versa. And they're just literally walking up and down the aisles of the train. And they're saying, who are you going to vote for? And they're reporting this back to Lincoln. And it's relatively accurate based on the numbers that we eventually see. And they start to realize as you get into the fall that as you start to get more and more endorsements from the likes of Frederick Douglass, speaking on behalf of African Americans, speaking on behalf of abolitionists, speaking on behalf of just other people who are now optimistic about the Union war effort above all else, they start to realize that, Lincoln is probably going to win in something of a landslide. And we'll start to see this sort of thing published in the Liberator, the most famous of the abolitionist newspapers, where Douglass is convincing other abolitionists. With this alternative clearly before us, all hesitation ought to cease, and every man who wishes well to the slave and to the country should at once rally with all the warmth and earnestness of his nature to the support of Abraham Lincoln and Andrew Johnson, and to the utter defeat and political annihilation of McClellan and George Pendleton, his running mate, who's a congressman from Ohio, for the election of the latter with their known what is that word? Antecedents, thank you, yes. When it's broken up like that, it's harder to read. Declared sentiments and the policy avowed in the Chicago platform will be the heaviest calamity of all these years of war and blood. Goes on from there saying, if you vote against Lincoln, you vote against the very nature of this war. And so the military situation only continues to improve. In the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia, Phil Sheridan wins at Cedar Creek in October. And Lincoln is going to start doing things like delaying or outright canceling soldiers being either put on court-martial or executions of soldiers, things like that. He's trying to get a little bit more on their good side. And this will continue for the rest of the war. There is a political motive here, but there's also a moral motive. As Lincoln starts to see the wars winding down, he doesn't want soldiers to be punished, especially by death, if the war is going to be effectively concluded and won not long after. He starts visiting more soldiers, visiting soldiers' homes around Washington, visits hospitals, things along those lines. And he's trying to basically combat the fact that he assumes George McClellan, because he literally commanded hundreds of thousands of these men, that McClellan will probably lock up the soldier vote. So Lincoln is trying to offset that. We'll see a series of advertisements. This will be a popular thing throughout that era. Banners such as these, ribbons, buttons, no yard signs yet as far as I know. That's what's going on. We can see clubs, the Lincoln and Johnson Club that comes about, ribbons that they'll be wearing, and then these big posters that would have filled walls of polling places, etc. And then we get to Election Day, 160 years ago, November 8th, 1864, after we've now traced the months leading up to this, the campaigns. And Lincoln, there we go. Whoop, there we go. Let's go back. Lincoln wins in a landslide. So I'll be the magic wall of CNN or one of the networks here, turn the color of the counties. But this is what the county map is going to look like. Of course, we have this vast swath of the states of the Confederacy where we won't see any vote contributing to this election. We can see this is a great example of how deep red or how deep blue these counties are. And then here's the Electoral College final. It's going to be a vast victory for Lincoln. He wins 212 to 21. McClellan is going to carry 3 states during the entirety of the election. But Lincoln is going to win in a relative landslide. Popular vote is a little closer, but still not that close. I think it's 54% to 45, 46%. But the most noteworthy statistic of all of the electorate is probably that Lincoln wins 3/4 of the soldier vote. It's that portion of the electorate that he's maybe least convinced that he can win, because so many of these soldiers fought under McClellan, but he'll win them pretty handily. Last couple points that I'll make here. Here we can see this is one of those classic 19th century banner series of headlines there that if you opened your paper the following day, this is the New York Tribune, and it will be that paper that inspired the title of this talk, which I think summarizes the effects of the 1864 election better than any other. It says simply that as the result of this election, the nation shall live and slavery shall die, so much and no more. And that really is what it comes down to, ultimately. These are the 2 headlines in Gettysburg. So this is from the Star and Sentinel, the local Republican paper. Lincoln elected and the country safe, breaks down some of the electoral numbers that had come in. Published on November 8th, so pretty remarkable. By telegram, by that evening, they are able to get in some of these vote counts. Some of them are not entirely in. They only have portions of them that are reported.
I don't see Arizona in there.
Arizona's not there, you're right, yeah. None of the other swing states are there, yeah. And then we'll see here in the Democratic compiler, it's interesting, they don't, here we have the broad headline is Lincoln elected. This one is celebrating that McClellan won Adams County by 524 votes. But Gettysburg itself, we can see Lincoln has I think it's 178, I think that's his 289, I'm pretty sure. Lincoln barely wins Gettysburg borough itself, but McClellan takes Adams County overall. And when we consider this is a town and a county that had welcomed Lincoln just 1 year earlier. And so they have literally seen not just the President of the United States in the abstract, but literally he has walked through their streets and spoken to them. Lincoln, of course, will, after winning this election, be inaugurated March 4th, 1865, delivering one of the great addresses in American presidential history, his second inaugural, assassinated just about 5 weeks later. George McClellan, though he loses this election, though he is really done with the military in the traditional way we know him as being involved in the Civil War, does have a nice political career of his own, becomes governor of New Jersey, becomes a mainstay at a lot of veterans organizations. He speaks at Antietam in the 1880s, ultimately dies in the 1880s as well. But I'll end with this. This is Lincoln's funeral train as it passes through Harrisburg, of course, nearby to us. The legacy of the 1864 election is all the things we listed a bit ago. That it happened at all in the middle of the Civil War, that it was a mandate on emancipation as a war measure, and it will eventually allow the creation of the 13th Amendment to abolish slavery. We can also see, of course, that it's an election of absolute unfulfilled potential, and it is the election that more than any other created perhaps the greatest what if in American history. What if Lincoln had lived? What if he had actually been able to enact the policies that were in that Republican platform of 1864? This is his funeral train passing through Harrisburg, April 21st or 22nd, 1865. A figure who has been sort of a minor character in our story throughout has been Frederick Douglass at a few points there. It's his endorsement that I think of Lincoln does go a long way in shaping a lot of abolitionists' opinions on Lincoln, especially. Douglass is called upon in Rochester, New York, just a few hours after he learned that Lincoln died on April 15th, 1865. And Douglass is asked to give some extemporaneous remarks. This is a president he had met 3 times. He had been a confidant to him. He had agitated Lincoln for the first couple of years of the war. But by the time Lincoln dies, they're speaking the same language. They're reading from the same text. And Douglass gets up at a church in Rochester, and he says in part that a dreadful disaster has befallen the nation. He talks about how if Lincoln was a good man, we need have no fear for his soul. And he says that although Lincoln dies, the Republic lives. And that, of course, will be a great lesson of the Civil War and the Civil War generation, is that the Republic did live. It did endure a Civil War. It did endure an election in the middle of the most contentious period in the nation's history. It'll have some negative consequences as time goes on and Andrew Johnson assumes the presidency. But ultimately, hopefully, we can see that there are some incredible effects that take place as a result of this 1864 election, one that I say certainly is among the most consequential in American history. So I've gone just a little over an hour here, but any questions that you have, I'd be happy to take them. And thank you all, as always, for being here.